It was just past dawn, and the California sky was a crisp, flawless blue, the kind of morning that feels too perfect to carry bad news. Elon Musk stood by the kitchen window of his quiet home, sipping a strong black coffee, unaware that the next moment would pull a thread so deep it would unravel something long buried inside him. The phone rang. He glanced at the screen. An international number, unknown, from South Africa. He hesitated, then answered. A man's voice came through, clipped and solemn. "Mr. Musk, I'm sorry to inform you, your father passed away early this morning." Elon froze. The words didn't quite register at first, just noise, like static in the background of an otherwise ordinary morning. Then, like a switch had been flipped inside him, silence took over. His eyes fixed on the window, but he saw nothing. His father, the man who had shaped him with strict hands and colder words. The man who had rarely smiled, who had often criticized, and who hadn't spoken to him directly in nearly 20 years, was gone. Gone. He didn't say thank you. He didn't ask how. He simply ended the call. The phone slipped from his fingers and landed softly on the counter. His chest tightened, but no tears came. Not yet. Not then. Memories surged forward like a sudden windstorm through an open door, uninvited and unstoppable. The long car rides in silence, the disapproving glances over dinner, the day he left South Africa and never looked back. But one image kept piercing through the bitterness. He was 8. He'd fallen from a tree and scraped his leg badly on a stone. It bled and he cried. His father, uncharacteristically gentle, had picked him up without a word and carried him inside. No lecturas, no cold remarks, just presence. That memory, that one small moment of care, now haunted him more than all the rest. Elon stood in the kitchen, unmoving for what felt like hours. Eventually, he walked into his study and sat behind his desk, still lost in thought. A clock ticked somewhere on the wall, but time, suddenly, felt irrelevant. He whispered the only words he could summon, "Why now?" There was no anger in his voice, only the weariness of regret. Not for things said, but for everything left unsaid. He tried to work, opened his laptop, checked emails, but the screen blurred before him, and each keystroke felt like dragging his own body through sand. That night, he found himself standing before a tall, antique cabinet he hadn't touched in years. With deliberate slowness, he opened the doors. Inside were fragments of a past he'd tried hard to forget. Old photographs, letters never sent, a worn leather belt that once belonged to his grandfather. And there, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, was a simple bracelet, made of brown leather, unevenly braided, with small initials burned into one side, Yem to Dad. He had made it when he was 10. His father had never worn it, but he had kept it. Elon held it in his hands as if it were a living thing, and then, gently, a single tear traced down his cheek. That's when his assistant knocked softly and entered. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said quietly. This was delivered by courier, from South Africa, left by a family attorney. She handed him a large envelope, aged at the edges, the kind used for legal documents or something more personal, something final. His hands trembled as he took it. It was unmarked except for a name scrawled in bold, slanted handwriting. Elon. He didn't have to turn it over. He knew that handwriting. It was his father's. The same firm, slanted script that had once signed his school permission slips and scrawled stern notes about discipline and responsibility. The same writing he hadn't seen in 2 decades. He didn't open the envelope right away. Just stared at it, heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. His breathing shallow, his thoughts a tangle of dread and longing. He pressed the envelope against his chest, holding it close like something sacred, fragile, dangerous. He didn't yet know what the letter inside would say. He didn't know if it would heal or wound, if it would offer peace or reopen every scar. But something deep in him, something beyond reason, knew that opening this envelope would change everything. And in truth, it already had. Because sometimes the heaviest things we carry aren't the memories of what happened, but the aching weight of what didn't. Now, if you felt something stir in your heart as you listened to Elon's story, something soft, something unspoken. Don't rush away just yet. Take a quiet moment with us. This channel isn't just about stories. It's about feelings we all share but rarely speak out loud, regrets, reconciliations, and second chances that come just in time, or sometimes a little too late. If that kind of storytelling means something to you, we'd love for you to stay. You can click like if this moved you. It tells us we're on the right path. And if you want to walk with us through the rest of this journey, subscribe. Not because it helps the channel, but because it helps you find your way back here when your heart needs a story again. We'll be here, always. The fire whispered in quiet flickers as Elon sat alone in the dimly lit room, the envelope resting atop his knees like something sacred. He hadn't lit the fire for warmth. It was late spring in California, but because the silence in the house felt too hollow without its quiet crackle. Even the flames seemed to know they weren't meant to distract. They too were waiting. He stared at the envelope for a long time, running his thumb along its edges, as if it might somehow open itself and spare him the act. The handwriting on the front had aged, familiar, angular, and unmistakably his father's. So much weight in one simple word. Elon. He took a slow breath, not just to steady his hands, but to ready his heart. Then carefully, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. It began simply. No preamble, no apologies, just two words. My son. So unassuming, so ordinary, and yet it struck him like a thunderclap. He wasn't ready for what followed. If you're reading this, it means I ran out of time to tell you what I should have said long ago. It means I'm no longer there to interrupt you with advice or questions, or that look you always hated. Elon swallowed hard, his jaw tightening. His eyes flicked to the flames, then back to the letter. You may not believe this, but I wrote this letter many times in my head, usually late at night when the house was quiet and the guilt was louder than sleep. I never had the courage to send it. His chest tightened. You were always more than I could understand. Brilliant, fierce, stubborn. I didn't know how to father someone like you. I wanted to shape you, but you were already made. And beautifully so. You made me laugh more than anyone, though I rarely showed it. Do you remember when you built that computer out of spare parts and tried to sell it to the neighbors? I was furious. Not because I disapproved, but because I knew, even then, you were going somewhere I couldn't follow. Elon exhaled slowly, the letter shaking in his hands. There was more. I watched everything. Every launch, every interview, every success. I cried alone, quietly, every time you proved the world wrong. I never said I was proud because I thought it would sound weak. But the truth is, you made my heart ache with pride. He reached up, covering his mouth, trying to hold something in, but it was already too late. A single tear escaped, trailing down his cheek. His father's voice, stilted, imperfect, but undeniably his, filled the room now. Line by line, I didn't know how to love in the way you needed. My own father never told me he loved me. I suppose I inherited that silence, thinking it was strength. But silence is a poor substitute for love. And my greatest regret is how long I let it speak for me. Elon paused. He lowered the letter to his lap, staring into the fire as the room blurred with unshed tears. The emotions crashing within him were beyond naming. Pain, gratitude, anger, forgiveness, and something more tender, something like mourning for the father he had and the one he might have known. He picked the letter up again and continued. When people ask me about my son, I pretend I don't know much. But the truth is, I know more than I ever let on. I know the weight you carry. I know how alone you must have felt. And I'm sorry for that. For not standing beside you when you needed me most. For letting pride get in the way of presence. Elon shifted forward, elbows on his knees, the firelight casting warm flickers across his face. If you ever wondered whether I loved you, I did. More than I knew how to say. More than I allowed myself to admit. You were my pride, even when I didn't act like it. Even when I said the opposite. And then came the final lines. The ones that undid him. My biggest mistake wasn't being hard on you. It was loving you in silence. And I pray that somehow, in some form beyond this world, you know now what I couldn't say in life." Elon dropped to his knees. The letter, still clutched in his hands, lowered to the carpet. He didn't sob. He didn't cry out. He simply knelt there, his entire body trembling under the weight of words he had longed to hear for a lifetime, but never dared to expect. Outside, the sky, which had been calm, began to tremble with rain. First a drizzle, then a steady rhythm against the windows, as if the heavens themselves had held back tears for this very moment. The fireplace crackled beside him, casting golden shadows on the walls. And still he knelt, breathing in silence, the letter still warm from his touch. The room felt full, though he was alone. Full of memories, full of what-ifs, full of a father's voice finally breaking through time and pride, and all the barriers that once stood between them. In the rain outside, Elon heard something more than water. He heard a father whispering what he'd always needed to say. "I'm proud of you. I loved you. I just didn't know how." And that perhaps was enough. The rain hadn't stopped. It whispered endlessly outside, a gentle, mournful rhythm against the windows. A sound that didn't demand attention, but somehow filled every corner of the house, like a lullaby for memories that had never been soothed. Elon walked slowly down the long hallway, the letter still pressed firmly to his chest. He wasn't reading it anymore. He didn't need to. Every word had already carved itself into him, not like ink on paper, but like time itself, leaving its mark in places no one could see. The weight of it was not in the letter itself, but in the realization that his silence had mirrored his father's more than he ever wanted to admit. Did he ever really know how much I loved him? The question rose inside him, not loud, but relentless. He had spent most of his life trying to outpace the man who raised him. And in that effort, he had also buried the very parts of himself that longed to connect, to understand, to forgive. Elon had always been private, focused, demanding, not just of others, of himself. He had prided himself on being clear-eyed and unsentimental. But now, in the soft echo of his father's final words, all that armor felt thin, brittle, almost childish. I became him, he thought almost bitterly. In the silence, in the distance, in the need to protect myself from pain by never saying too much. He remembered with painful clarity the last time he said, "I love you" to his father. He was 12. They were standing outside a hardware store. His father had bought him a small toolbox, his first real one. Elon was so excited that he blurted it out. "Thanks, Dad. I love you." The older man had nodded, maybe smiled, but said nothing in return. And that silence it echoed for decades. After that, the words had stayed locked inside him, growing heavier with every year. He had skipped phone calls, turned down visits, sent gifts without notes. It hadn't always been out of anger. Sometimes it was just easier than facing the awkward weight of what they couldn't say to each other. And now he would never hear his father's voice again. Never watch him walk through the door again. Never get to say plainly, "I missed you." But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to say it in some other way. Elon turned back toward the sitting room, the one with the fireplace still flickering low, the chair where he'd first read the letter. He sat at the desk in the corner, a piece of furniture he rarely used, pulled out a single sheet of heavy paper. He stared at it for a long time, then picked up a pen. He wrote just one word, "Dad," and stopped. A tight breath escaped his chest, almost a sob. The grief wasn't clean. It was tangled, old, full of thorny branches and unspoken sentences. But he didn't stop. He let the tears fall, slow and soundless, as he wrote with shaky hands, the ink bleeding slightly where it mixed with salt. "I've spent most of my life angry at you. Not just for what you said, but for what you never said. I thought I had to harden myself to survive you. And maybe I did. But in doing that, I closed the door to something more important. Love." He paused, blinked hard, then continued. "I don't know when I stopped saying, 'I loved you.' Maybe when you stopped saying it back. Maybe because I was scared I'd say it and get silence again. But I need to say it now. I love you, Dad." He sat back, his chest rising and falling like waves in a storm. He let the silence of the room hold him for a moment. The rain still whispered against the glass. Steady, present. And then, as if summoned by the memory, another image returned, one that hadn't crossed his mind in years. He was 6. His father had been fixing an outlet in the kitchen. Elon had crouched beside him, full of questions. The man had handed him a screwdriver, let him twist a wire, then said, almost without thinking, "You've got hands like an engineer." At the time, Elon hadn't understood the weight of that statement. But now, it struck him as the closest thing to encouragement his father had ever voiced. And he had carried those words all his life, not even knowing it. He looked down at the paper. "You saw me more than I thought you did. You gave me something I didn't recognize until now. I forgive you, Dad. And I hope you can forgive me too." The last line came not as a conclusion, but as a release. Elon signed his name, not with formality, but with something softer, then folded the letter gently. He didn't want to hide it away. No, this wasn't a message to be buried in a drawer or sealed in a box. This was the beginning of something else, something that needed to live. "I'm going to do something with this," he said aloud, voice steady despite the tightness in his throat. "Something that matters." Because words unspoken could become seeds. And maybe, just maybe, from all this sorrow, something beautiful could grow. He stood, holding the letter against his chest, just as he had held his father's. The fire burned on, warm and steady. Outside, the rain continued, no longer mournful but rhythmic, cleansing. Like the sky, too, had finally begun to let go. When Elon opened his eyes the next morning, something had shifted. It wasn't the usual sense of urgency that came with quarterly goals or launch timelines. It wasn't tied to numbers, meetings, or media. This feeling was older, deeper, quieter, and far more certain. There was something he had to do, not for shareholders, not for history, but for himself, and for someone who was no longer here, his father. But not just for him, for every father who had struggled to say the words that mattered, for every child who had lived with questions they'd never had the chance to ask, for the ache that outlived the people who caused it. That morning, he sat by the fire again, the letter now folded neatly in his breast pocket like a talisman. He wasn't reading it anymore. He carried it, as if its weight reminded him of the thousands, perhaps millions, who carried similar words left unsaid. He picked up his phone and called one of his closest collaborators, not from SpaceX, not from Tesla, but from a private foundation that specialized in designing community spaces. "I have an idea," he said. "It's not business. It's something different." She listened as he spoke, slow at first, unsure of how to articulate what was forming in his mind. But soon, the words came like a tide. "A memorial," he said, "but not statues, not marble or metal. A place made of silence and words." He wanted a garden, a sacred space that anyone could enter, whether grieving, remembering, or seeking closure. No gatekeepers, no cameras, no expectations, just a place where letters could live. "I want it to be called the Garden of Unsent Letters," he told her. "A place where people write to the ones they lost, or the ones who never listened, or the ones who never knew how to love right." The idea was met with stunned silence on the other end. Then gently, "That's beautiful, Elon." And for once, he didn't deflect the compliment. He simply said, "It's time." Within days, sketches began to take shape. Elon requested only natural elements, trees that offered shade without stealing light, stone benches with soft curves, winding pathways that encouraged wandering rather than rushing. At the garden center, there would be a weathered bronze box, not sealed with locks, but open like a mailbox to the wind. People could leave their letters there, folded, crumpled, stained with tears, and walk away lighter. No names, no archive, no digital memory, just release. Each letter would remain unread, known only to the sky, the leaves, and perhaps the souls they were meant for. His team questioned the lack of technology. "Elon, we could scan the letters, turn them into something lasting." "No," he interrupted, softly but firmly. "Some things aren't meant to last. Some things just need to be let go. Still, there were skeptics. Some said it was sentimental. Others called it naive. He listened, and then, as he always did when something truly mattered to him, he smiled and did it anyway. "This will be my apology," he said, "and my thank you." The press hadn't caught wind of the project yet, and Elon preferred it that way. It wasn't about publicity. It was about creating a space he himself would have needed had the letter never arrived. But even as the plans for the memorial progressed, something unexpected began to unfold. An old cousin from Pretoria reached out after hearing of his father's passing. She sent a message, "I'm not sure you ever knew the full story." They spoke over video call. She sat in a sunlit garden, visibly aged, her eyes kind but burdened with memory. "Your father," she began, her voice faltering. "He wasn't an easy man, but there were things he never told anyone." She told Elon about the quiet donations, the visits to a small orphanage tucked behind the city's edge, always anonymous, always discreet. Once a week, without fail, he delivered groceries and asked for no recognition. More startling, every Sunday, he sat with a paralyzed boy named David, reading to him. Not once did he mention it to family, not even in passing. Elon sat back, stunned. It didn't fit the man he remembered, the stern lectures, the emotional distance. And yet it did. It explained the silences, the guardedness, the hidden ache of a man who perhaps didn't believe he deserved to be known for his softness. He ended the call and sat in darkness for a long time. How much of his father had he never truly known? How many men like him loved in shadows, too proud or too wounded to step into the light? The question haunted him, but it also solidified something. This garden, it's not just for my father, it's for all of them. For the men who showed love in acts too quiet to be noticed. For the sons and daughters left wondering if they were ever truly seen. For the legacy of silence that had carried through generations, quietly stealing moments that should have been shared. He returned to his team with a new urgency. "I don't want this to be polished," he said. "I want it to feel raw, real, human." They added natural stone from South African quarries. They planted olive trees, symbols of peace and endurance. A single sycamore was placed at the garden center, its wide branches reaching like arms. Beneath it would rest the box of unsent letters. No cameras, no internet, no signal, just a quiet place where hearts could whisper to the ones who were no longer there or had never really been. The project moved quickly, but Elon knew he couldn't dedicate it until one final piece was in place. He needed to return to South Africa, not for a ceremony, not for closure, but to visit the places his father had gone in secret, to meet the boy named David, to walk the dusty paths his father had walked alone. He needed to meet the man behind the silence, and only then, he felt, could the garden truly begin to bloom. On an unannounced flight, without entourage or media, Elon Musk quietly boarded a plane to Pretoria. There were no tweets, no assistants, no media waiting at the terminal. Just a man in a window seat, lost in thought, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as if trying to catch a glimpse of his past somewhere between the clouds. In his jacket pocket, he carried 2 letters, one written by his late father before he died, and the other written by Elon himself just days ago, between tears and hesitant strokes of ink. They were folded carefully, one against his chest, the other against his soul. The moment the plane touched down on South African soil, Elon felt it, something old, raw, familiar. The air was warm, tinged with that dry fragrance of sun-baked earth and childhood memories. It was like the land remembered him, even if he had tried for years to forget. He declined the offer of a car service and rented a small, dusty sedan. The drive through Pretoria was strange and nostalgic. The city had aged, some buildings had crumbled a bit, new ones had grown in their place, but the bones of it were still the same. Each street corner held a memory, some sharp as broken glass, others soft as old lullabies. When he reached the neighborhood of his childhood, his grip on the steering wheel tightened. And then there it was, the house. Weathered by time, but still standing, like an elder relative who had seen too much and refused to fall. The gate stood crooked, rusted but strangely loyal, a silent sentinel holding decades of silence and unsaid things behind it. Elon stepped out and approached slowly. The latch gave way with a stubborn creak that echoed like a ghost calling his name. Each step on the gravel sounded louder than it should have. It wasn't just gravel, it was footsteps from a past that had been trying to catch up with him. The yard was overgrown, weeds tangled with forgotten flowers. But the bench was still there, under the mango tree they had planted together when Elon was just a boy. That tree was now tall and strong, offering generous shade, its branches moving gently in the breeze like a father's tired hand reaching out. He sat down slowly, almost reverently, on that bench. He didn't speak for a long time, just listened, to the wind, to the memories. Then, with a trembling hand, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the 2 letters. He laid them on the wooden bench beside him, like 2 old souls finally face to face after a lifetime of waiting. "Dad," Elon whispered, "we're here, together, even if it's late." And just like that, the walls inside him cracked. Tears came freely, not as protest or pain, but as surrender. His body shook with sobs he didn't try to control. He wasn't the billionaire. He wasn't the innovator. He was a son, just a son, one who had loved deeply and remained silent for too long. He stood up slowly and walked toward the tree. The soil at its base was soft, still warm from the morning sun. He knelt, dug gently, not with tools but with his hands. He wanted to feel the earth. He wanted to know it could hold what he was about to leave there. He wrapped both letters in a piece of white linen, folding them as carefully as one folds a newborn's blanket. Then he placed them inside the small hollow he had carved in the ground. "Let these roots carry what we never could," he said, his voice thick, almost breaking. He covered the letters with soil, pressing it down softly, as if tucking them in for a final rest. The tree stood still above him, tall and silent, bearing witness. He sat again, wiping his face, watching the sun dip low into the sky, turning the clouds a bruised shade of orange and pink. The silence was no longer heavy. It was full, sacred. In that quiet hour, something inside him shifted. Not broke, shifted. As if the boy he had once been, with scraped knees and silent tears, had finally found the man he had become. And they were no longer strangers. This wasn't closure. Closure was too neat, too final. This was a beginning, a new story, one where love didn't have to be loud to be real, where even the unspoken carried weight, where the mango tree now held secrets not of pain, but of healing. He stood up as night began to fall. The stars above Pretoria blinked on one by one, like eyes opening in the dark. Behind him, the house still stood, but Elon no longer needed to enter it. What he had come for was buried beneath that tree. And in doing so, he had found something he never thought he'd touch again: peace. He turned back toward the car, his steps lighter than they had been in years. The garden of unsent letters was already alive in his heart, and soon it would live in the world. But tonight, in the quiet of Pretoria, under a tree rooted in memory, Elon Musk had spoken the truth out loud, even if no one was there to hear it, except perhaps his father. Back in California, Elon Musk stood quietly at the edge of an empty plot of land. The space was nestled beside a public school, simple, overlooked, but now destined for something greater. Morning fog rolled gently through the trees, as if nature itself were preparing for a transformation. Behind him stood a small group: architects, landscapers, poets, and at Elon's request, a grief counselor and a historian of emotional memory. It was not the usual lineup for a Musk project, but this wasn't a usual project. "I want this place to heal what was never answered," Elon said, his voice low, a crack just barely breaking through the last word. He didn't need slides or data projections, just those words. Everyone understood. The concept was daring in its simplicity, a living memorial not to people who were famous or heroic in the public sense, but to those who mattered in silence: mothers, fathers, guardians. It would not be a site of grand speeches. It would be a garden of letters, a sacred space for what was never said. A soft path of gravel would wind through small groves of olive trees and paper barks. Along the way, visitors could sit on curved stone benches, each bearing a plaque etched with the name of a parent or guardian who had passed on. Some were donated. Others were sent in as names, just names, by people who never had the courage or chance to say goodbye. At the center would be the soul of the place, a single weathered iron box, riveted, dignified, timeless. They called it the box of guarded words. It was designed to endure time and the elements, standing still while the world poured its feelings into it. Anyone could approach and slide a letter inside. The letters would never be read. Not by Elon, not by staff, not by historians. They would remain sealed forever. Their power was not in being opened, but in being released. Elon insisted on no press, no announcement, no social media rollout. Let the garden find who it's meant to, he told his assistant. And so for weeks, the workers built in silence, guided by hushed respect and a strange tenderness that settled over the site like mist. But something that deep cannot stay hidden for long. One photo leaked, a single bench with the inscription, "For my mother, who smiled through her own sadness." It was shared quietly, then widely. Soon, the project began to echo across the internet like a whisper that grows into a song. People from around the world began to send in their letters. Some were printed on wrinkled notebook paper, others on elegant stationery. A few were typed out by shaking hands or dictated by children to their grandparents. A woman from Missouri wrote, "I never told you I forgave you. Now I can." A teenager from Sao Paulo sent a letter folded into the shape of a paper airplane. "Thanks for teaching me to dream, even if you weren't there to see it." One note arrived on the back of a fast food receipt. "Dad, I get it now. I'm sorry too." The letters arrived by the thousands, pouring in from hospitals, schools, prisons, shelters, and military bases. Elon read a few, only a few, late at night, sitting on a low bench as construction lights glowed behind him. Some made him smile, others left him still and blinking back tears. He never read them aloud. They weren't his to share, but they changed him. "I've built rockets," he once whispered to a worker placing a stepping stone, "but nothing has ever felt like this." Some days he stayed for hours, watching as strangers wandered in, quiet, cautious, reverent. Some came alone. Others held the hands of children or the photos of loved ones. Some sat and wrote immediately. Others just walked. Everyone seemed to know what to do. It was as if the garden was whispering guidance. It became clear this was more than a personal project. This was collective redemption, a place for all the words stuck in throats, all the love trapped behind pride, fear, anger, or time. And in each visitor, Elon saw his own story mirrored. He remembered how many times he could have called his father and didn't. How many birthdays passed unspoken. How many small moments, an article shared, a joke remembered, went unshared. And now, here, they all echoed in the garden's wind. He didn't regret building rockets. He didn't regret pushing toward Mars. But he began to wonder how many people like him had chosen distance over dialogue and were now trying to return. That's what the garden became, a return. Not to a person, but to the possibility of peace. Then one afternoon, a man in a wheelchair arrived with a nurse. The man, elderly, held a yellowed envelope with shaking fingers. He rolled to the iron box, pressed the envelope inside, and stayed there for almost 10 minutes. Not moving, not speaking, just breathing. When he finally turned, he looked at Elon, who had been standing off to the side. "You gave me my last conversation," the man said. Elon didn't respond with words. He simply nodded, his eyes full. The project was nearly complete now. Trees rooted, benches set. The iron box, solid as ever, already cradling thousands of unheard words. But there was one final detail missing. Elon stood alone at the center one evening, just after sunset. In his hand was a small plaque. He knelt and placed it at the base of the mango tree now replanted from Pretoria soil, flown in and tended by expert hands. The plaque read, "For my father, who taught me how to be strong and how to forgive. This garden is for you." And with that, the circle was complete. The envelope arrived on a quiet Tuesday morning, just days before the memorial garden was set to open. It was thick, old-fashioned, and bore a wax seal that looked like it had been pressed with trembling hands. The return address said Pretoria. Elon paused. He knew no one in Pretoria anymore, at least no one who would write to him. When he tore it open, a small golden key fell into his lap. It was delicate, the kind used for old safes or heirloom boxes. Wrapped around it was a handwritten letter, yellowed at the edges. Mr. Musk, it began in the spidery cursive of someone long past his prime. Your father left strict instructions. This key, and what it opens, was to reach you only if you read his final letter. He hoped, perhaps foolishly, that if you reached that point, you would be ready. It was signed, Leon van der Westhuizen, attorney at law, retired. Elon stared at the key. It weighed so little, and yet it felt like a door. A door he hadn't known existed, one his father had never mentioned. He turned the letter over. Scribbled in thick blue ink was an address, the name of an old bank he vaguely remembered seeing once as a boy, nestled in the crumbling heart of downtown Pretoria. By nightfall, Elon was on a plane alone. There was no team this time. No aides, no press, no schedule. Just him, the key, and the memory of a man who had once been a mystery wrapped in stern silence. Pretoria greeted him with its dry warmth and jacaranda-lined streets. Everything looked older, smaller. The bank building, half swallowed by the vines of neglect, still stood tall in its stubborn, colonial style. Inside, the marble floors echoed under his steps. The manager, a silver-haired gentleman with a surname that suggested Dutch ancestry, looked up from a worn-out desk and blinked in disbelief. "Mr. Musk?" he asked quietly, as if uttering a ghost's name. "I believe my father left something here," Elon said, holding out the letter. Within minutes, he was being led through a hallway lined with dusty portraits and yellowed wallpaper. At the end was a small, locked vault room. No surveillance cameras, no glowing keypads, just old brass, time-worn hinges, and silence. The key turned smoothly, almost reverently. Inside the safe was a carved wooden box, rich with African tribal patterns, polished by decades of waiting. Elon opened it slowly. Inside lay a leather-bound journal, worn at the edges but meticulously kept. Tied around it was a fraying ribbon, and on the first page, in his father's unmistakable handwriting, were 5 simple words. "My days with my son." Elon sat down on the wooden bench in the corner of the vault. The room had no windows, but the soft yellow glow of a hanging lamp warmed the air. He opened the journal. Each page was a portal. His father had written about the first time Elon climbed onto a bicycle without help. About the time he tried to build a mini rocket using a soda can and a bottle of lighter fluid. About the science fair in 6th grade when Elon's volcano model didn't erupt on cue and he burst into tears, and how his father had waited until they got home to hug him in the privacy of their quiet kitchen. "I was proud," one entry said, "but I didn't want him to become soft. I see now I mistook silence for strength." Further in the journal, the tone shifted. The entries grew longer, more reflective. There were passages that admitted to anger, to fear, to jealousy even. Jealousy of Elon's ambition, of his ability to leave without looking back. The day he left for Canada, I sat in his room for hours. I touched every book on his shelf. I found a Lego piece under the bed and cried like a child. Page after page, Elon's face changed, softened, cracked, healed. His father hadn't just remembered him. He had studied him, missed him, loved him. One final page stopped him cold. I didn't know how to hold him close. I only knew how to let him go. And so I hoped that one day he would find me here, not in body, but in words. Elon closed the journal gently and rested it on his lap. The air in the vault felt heavier now, as if it too was mourning the space between them. Not a physical space, but the unspoken years, the wrong assumptions, the stubborn silences that had filled every phone call with static. He sat there for what felt like a lifetime. No one disturbed him. There was no need. That room, that box, that journal, it was their final conversation. When he finally rose, he left the wooden box where he found it, but tucked the journal carefully into the inside pocket of his jacket. As he stepped out into the African sun, everything looked different. The jacaranda blossoms seemed brighter. The air smelled of dust and redemption. In the cab back to his hotel, he didn't check his phone once. He watched the city slide by, vendors, children, faded murals, sun-beaten windows. Somewhere in those streets, his father had once walked, once lived, once loved, and now, through ink and memory, he spoke. Elon whispered to no one, "You did hold me, Dad. I just didn't see it." And for the first time in years, he felt like someone's son again. The sun hung low over the California sky, casting a honeyed light over the almost finished garden. Dust still lingered in the air as the final paving stones were set into place, their edges gently hugging the curves of the flower beds and pathways. But Elon Musk wasn't looking at any of that. He stood beneath the tallest tree in the garden, the twin sycamores at the heart of the project, and stared at the shallow patch of dirt between them. His jaw was set, his breath slow. In his hands, he held the box. Not just any box. Inside was the handwritten journal of his father, the man he had both feared and longed for his entire life. That journal, with its pages full of misspelled words and awkward grammar, was more honest and more intimate than any conversation they'd ever had. It was as if each sentence inside had carried the weight of decades. Elon had read it cover to cover more than once, the words echoing inside him like a soft hymn. Now he was about to do something no press release, no media stunt, no televised interview could ever explain. A private tribute, a message not to the world, but to a man already gone, and to the little boy who still lived inside him. He knelt. Quietly, carefully, he placed the journal into a carved wooden capsule. The capsule had been crafted by an old artisan in Cape Town, an elderly man with weathered hands and misty eyes who didn't ask many questions when Elon requested something simple but eternal. Alongside the journal, Elon placed a miniature sculpture, a hand-sized rocket shaped from smooth iron and coated in matte silver. It was imperfect by design, slightly asymmetrical, a few notches along the fins. The artisan had insisted on leaving those. "Like fathers," he said with a half-smile. "Rough edges, but they still aim for the sky." The grave was modest, no deeper than a child's sandbox. Elon pressed his hand against the capsule one last time. Then, with slow movements, he began to cover it with soil. Handful after handful. No shovel, no gloves, just fingers in earth, like planting something sacred. Around the buried tribute, landscapers had planted a circle of white lilies, fresh, elegant, and radiant in their simplicity. They were chosen intentionally. White for peace, lilies for remembrance. No one but Elon knew what lay beneath those flowers. There would be no plaque, no signage, no guiding stone. Just presence, just silence. It was his invisible statue. Later that afternoon, the final touches on the garden were completed. Paths were swept, benches cleaned, petals gently trimmed. The workers, many of whom had been skeptical when the project began, now walked the grounds in quiet awe. Some even cried. One of them, a young mason named Javier, approached Elon and said, "I've built things all my life, Mr. Musk. But this feels like building someone's soul." Elon didn't speak. He just nodded and put a hand on the man's shoulder. He wandered the garden slowly, as if absorbing its meaning with every step. Each tree had been planted with care. Each bench bore the engraved name of someone who had received a letter, sometimes too late, but always written with love. There were oaks for strength, jacarandas for memory, and a single magnolia near the entrance where the sunlight always fell first. At the center of it all stood the iron structure, the box of guarded words. It looked ancient, though it had been forged only weeks before. It had no lock, only a hinged flap through which visitors could slip their letters, written on paper, printed from phones, or even scribbled on napkins. Words that were never said in time, now whispered into metal and shadow. Elon stepped toward it slowly, pulling something from the inside pocket of his blazer. A folded sheet of cream stationery. The ink was slightly smudged from where his fingers had gripped it too tightly. He unfolded it. "Father," it began. The rest of the letter was simple. Not poetic, not groundbreaking, just honest. A confession of regret, an offering of forgiveness, a declaration of delayed love. It ended with a phrase Elon had never spoken aloud until he wrote it down. "I understand now, and I'm proud of you too." He placed the letter gently into the iron box. There was no sound, no clang, just a soft slip, like placing a memory into time itself. Then he turned and walked away. No grand opening would take place. No celebrities. No ribbon cutting. Elon had instructed his team to keep the gates open, always, but never to advertise them. "Who needs to come?" he'd said. "We'll find it." That's enough. But word had spread anyway. The whisper of the garden had traveled through hearts, not headlines. Letters poured in from around the world. Messages written in Arabic, Hindi, Spanish, Russian, Afrikaans. Children scribbled drawings for fathers they barely remembered. Grown men who hadn't cried in decades wept as they deposited paragraphs written at 3 a.m. Women who had raised their children alone wrote letters to partners who had never returned but were still mourned in secret. It became a place not of grief, but of reconciliation. Elon came at dusk, sometimes alone, sometimes with one of his children. He never brought a phone. He never stayed long. But he always paused by the bed of white lilies, the invisible statue, and whispered something no one else could hear. Thank you, maybe. Or maybe nothing at all. Because some truths, like certain kinds of love, don't need to be spoken. They just need to be held. Quietly, reverently, eternally. The sun had barely risen on the second day of the memorial's existence when a soft shuffle of steps broke the morning stillness. Elon, sitting quietly on a bench near the edge of the garden, looked up. At first, he saw only the blurred silhouettes of figures moving through the trees. But as they drew closer, the scene became clearer. A group of elderly women, some leaning on canes, others helping each other along the gravel paths. Their faces bore time's tender marks, but in their eyes sparkled something even more powerful than grief, a longing to speak. They carried envelopes clutched gently in their wrinkled hands. Some had flowers tucked into their arms, violets, roses, daisies, each a fragile symbol of memory. Elon stood slowly, feeling the weight of their presence in his chest like a swell of tide rising against the shore of his still fragile heart. One of the women broke away from the group and walked up to him. She was dressed in a light pink cardigan, the edges of her skirt brushing the tops of her shoes. Her eyes were a watery gray, and her voice trembled like a wind chime in winter. "I hope it's all right," she said softly. "We came to write letters. Not to our parents, but to our children." Elon blinked, surprised. His voice caught. "Of course," he finally whispered. She smiled faintly. "I lost my son 10 years ago. Never had the courage to tell him I forgave him for leaving the way he did. But I loved him, you see, more than anything." As she walked away, Elon remained rooted to the spot, breath caught between sorrow and revelation. He hadn't anticipated this. He had created the garden for children longing to reach the past, but now the past was coming forward too. It was as if time itself was bending inside the garden, folding regrets into words, pain into petals. The women took their places throughout the memorial. Some sat quietly on the benches, their names still blank, and began writing slowly, carefully. Others knelt before the iron box in the center, tracing their fingers along its weathered surface as if it were a relic from their own dreams. They placed their letters inside with the delicacy of someone setting down a newborn. Their hands lingered at the opening, reluctant to let go. Elon kept his distance, giving them the space they needed, but he watched as decades of silence were unraveled in ink. Watched as hearts that had long believed it was too late found a place to breathe. One woman, tall and elegant despite the curve in her spine, approached the iron box with a single letter. As she placed it inside, she murmured, "If one day you miss me, I'll be between these trees." Another, with silver hair braided down her back, whispered to no one in particular, "I don't know if I was a good mother, but you, my son, were my best poem." The words echoed through the garden like psalms. Elon walked over to the landscaping team that remained on site, touched by the morning's grace. "We need blue flowers around the box," he said, "for the mothers who loved beyond what they knew." They planted hydrangeas and forget-me-nots, flowers that spoke in shades of quiet devotion. A few days later, as autumn fully embraced the land and leaves began to float like soft confessions onto the gravel paths, Elon received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just his name written in handwriting he didn't recognize. Inside was a single page, lined and creased. "I am your aunt," it began. "Your father wrote to me often in his final months. He told me he feared he would leave this world before making peace with you, that he had failed at many things, being gentle, being expressive, but not at loving you. When he found out you had read his letter, he smiled like a boy again." Elon pressed the letter to his chest, his eyes stinging. It was the kind of ache that didn't clamor, didn't scream. It simply bloomed, slow and steady, across the soul. A healing ache, a graceful wound. The leaves continued falling. The garden seemed to breathe with them, shedding what it no longer needed, making space for the new. And in each step Elon took through its paths, he heard the soft crunch of forgiveness. He began to understand something elemental. This place was no longer his. It belonged to everyone who had ever loved incompletely, spoken too late, or stayed silent for fear of not being understood. Fathers came. Mothers came. Some children brought their letters for parents they had never met. Widows wrote to the husbands who had left without a word. Sisters wrote to brothers lost to addiction. Every kind of love and absence had found its way to this unlikely sanctuary. One visitor left a note on a bench and signed, "This place lets us say what our voices couldn't." That night, Elon remained after everyone had gone. He sat near the iron box, the moonlight pooling around him like a quiet witness. He didn't write a letter. He didn't need to. The words had already been given form, in benches, in petals, in silence. He stood and looked around. The garden had changed again. It was no longer just the garden of unsent letters. It was now a living archive of human longing, a cathedral of unfinished sentences, a sanctuary of second chances. And in the hush of the wind through the trees, it felt like every missed goodbye, every quiet love, every withheld apology had finally found a home. The night before his father's birthday, Elon Musk couldn't sleep. Not even the quiet hum of California's coastal wind could calm the storm inside his chest. The letter, the diary, the silent memorial beneath the trees. All of it played like an unfinished movie in his mind, scene after scene, spoken and unspoken, blurred into memory. He left the house in silence, barefoot, wrapped in a wool blanket. The cold air bit gently at his skin, but he welcomed it. It was the kind of night that demanded honesty, the kind that stripped away every performance. He walked slowly down the path lined with fallen leaves until he reached the furthest bench in the garden, the one facing the lake where no visitors ever sat. The moonlight glistened on the still water. Above him, the sky stretched wide and open, peppered with stars that shimmered like they knew secrets. Elon sank into the bench, pulling the blanket tighter around him, and closed his eyes. The scent of jasmine lingered in the air. Then he dreamt. In the dream, the garden was bathed in soft golden light, not from the sun or moon, but from something more tender. He turned, and there, seated beside him, was his father. Younger, stronger, smiling in a way Elon had never seen, not in photographs, not in memories. "You came," his father said, his voice both familiar and foreign. "I knew you would." Elon didn't speak right away. His throat was tight, as if the words had waited too long to find a voice. "I was late," Elon finally said, "but I came with everything I am." His father chuckled gently, a laugh that echoed with regret and warmth all at once. "You were never late. I was simply early and clumsy with time." They sat for a moment, not looking at each other, but up toward the constellations that had guided them both in such different ways. Then the father turned. "You've become more than I ever imagined." "And you," Elon whispered, "were more than I ever understood." The distance that had existed between them, years, choices, silence, collapsed in that dream. And with a single breath, the father opened his arms. Elon leaned into them, slowly, then completely, resting his head on the shoulder he had once feared and misunderstood. They embraced. It wasn't just a hug, it was a surrender. A meeting of grief and grace. Of father and son not at war, but finally at peace. When Elon awoke, it was still night. But something had changed. His body trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the rawness of what had just occurred. His hands were damp, and his throat ached. Yet his heart felt light, like it had let go of something heavy, something too long carried. He looked up. The sky remained perfectly clear. A breeze moved the branches above him like a lullaby. Elon rose slowly, barefoot still, and walked to the center of the garden, to the iron box. With no ceremony, no pen but memory, he scribbled a small note on the back of an old receipt he found in his coat pocket. "Today I didn't cry. Today I gave thanks." He folded the note and placed it into the box. And just as he stepped back, a hummingbird, brilliant green with a shimmer of gold, fluttered into view. It hovered for a heartbeat, then another, and finally perched gently on the bench his father used to favor during construction visits. The tiny creature sat still, unafraid, watching. Elon's breath caught. The world was silent around him, but the air was full of presence. He felt it not in thought, but in the marrow of his bones. The message had arrived. Not through wires or screens or satellites, but through the quiet language of forgiveness. It had reached its destination, not in time, but in the heart. The bird darted away, disappearing among the trees. Elon remained still, eyes fixed on the bench as if expecting something more. But nothing came. Or rather, everything had already come. He turned and walked back toward the house, the blanket brushing against his ankles like soft rain. The garden behind him glowed faintly in the moonlight. Each tree whispered stories. Each bench cradled a truth. And the flowers, those persistent witnesses, swayed as if they too understood what had just unfolded. A son's dream, a father's return, a reunion beyond the laws of life. It would become, in time, one of Elon's most private treasures. He never told anyone about the dream. Not his assistants, not his inner circle, not even the architects of the memorial. But from that night on, visitors to the garden often commented that the air near the lake bench felt different, softer, warmer, as if something unseen had been left there and still lingered. Elon, in his quiet moments, would sometimes return to that bench, not to seek answers, but to listen, to rest, to remember the man he once feared, once resented, and now, finally loved. That was the magic of that night. Not that it changed the past, but that it gave it room to breathe. And in doing so, Elon Musk, visionary, inventor, disruptor, discovered the deepest truth of all. That healing doesn't come from erasing what happened. It comes from letting it bloom, even in dreams. The morning began like any other, quiet and silver-lit by the early sun, with dew resting on the leaves of the white flowers Elon had planted in honor of his father. The garden was still. The wooden benches bore witness to unread letters, whispered apologies, and the rustling grief of visitors who had passed through like shadows. Elon, as usual, walked silently through the winding paths, his fingers trailing along the backs of the benches, pausing by the central iron box, the box of unspoken words, to leave a fresh letter of his own. He didn't know the world was about to arrive. By mid-morning, his assistant gently approached him near the grove of mango trees. She was holding a folded newspaper, her hands trembling slightly. "You should see this," she said. Elon took it, only half interested, until his eyes landed on the headline. "The Place Where Hearts Still Meet" by Thomas Renner. The name struck a chord. Thomas Renner, a retired journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner in the 80s, known for his rare ability to write grief without sentimentality. Elon hadn't known Renner had visited the garden, let alone written about it. But there it was, an entire spread, detailing his experience of writing to his late son and leaving the letter in the quiet of the memorial. It was honest, unfiltered, full of regret and raw beauty. But what stood out most was the closing line. "I came with guilt. I left with something close to peace." This garden does not belong to Elon Musk. It belongs to all of us who never got to say goodbye. In less than 24 hours, the story exploded. It was shared by morning shows, spiritual bloggers, grief counselors, and people who never cared for the news, but somehow found themselves tagging friends and family in the article. Comments flooded in from every corner of the world. TikToks of people crying while reading the piece. Voice recordings of elderly parents whispering apologies. Hashtags like hashtag letters of love, hashtag the garden speaks, and hashtag words that waited began trending. Elon didn't answer the phone calls. Not the networks, not the publishers, not the influencers asking for collaborations. It's not a spectacle, he told his team. This isn't a launch. This is a whisper, and whispers don't need microphones. But he did do one thing. He created a quiet Instagram account under the handle @WhisperSynthGarden. No name, no bio. Just scanned images of some of the letters, always with the writer's permission. Each post carried only a few lines, handwritten, sometimes smeared with tears. They resonated deeply. People paused mid-scroll, silenced by the vulnerability. Dad, I hated you for leaving, but now I see maybe you never truly left. Mama, I was so busy growing up that I never thank you for giving up your dreams for mine. To the child I never held, I still count your birthdays in silence. The account gained millions of followers in days, not because it was viral, but because it felt necessary. In a world cluttered with noise, something about these raw fragments of human connection felt like oxygen. Soon, the garden became a destination, not for tourists, but for pilgrims of the heart. A woman flew from Seoul to leave a letter for her husband, who had died in an accident they never resolved. A man from Dublin came alone with a box of childhood drawings to bury beneath a tree. Grandmothers from Brazil brought hand-knitted scarves to place on benches, saying he always hated the cold. A priest from Rome sat for hours in silence before finally leaving a note that read, "Forgive me. I feared loving you would make me weak." The security guards hired to keep the space safe stopped taking shifts. They couldn't interrupt moments like these. One afternoon, Elon walked quietly past a young woman sitting on the grass with a notebook. She looked up, recognizing him, but didn't say a word. He nodded gently and kept walking. Moments later, she rose, left her folded letter on a bench, and whispered, "Thank you." That was all. Reporters camped outside the garden gates, hoping for a statement. Elon issued one written sentence to be posted at the entrance. "This is not my story. It is ours. Come as you are. Leave what you must." The ripples began to echo beyond California. In Kyoto, a quiet park was repurposed by a local temple to honor missed goodbyes. In Lisbon, school children began writing letters to grandparents they never met. In Mendoza, Argentina, a vineyard owner created a memorial path between rows of vines where letters could be tied to trees. They all cited the same inspiration: the garden. A single act of reconciliation between a son and his long-distant father had birthed a global movement of healing. It was a phenomenon without branding, without merchandise, without logos. And yet it spread like wildfire, carried on the breath of grief and love, twin forces that need no translation. Elon never spoke publicly about the article, never reposted it, never retweeted it. But late one night, as the garden lay silent under a sheet of moonlight, he walked alone to the central box. He placed a letter inside. It simply read, "Dear Thomas Renner, thank you for breaking the silence. For all of us." He closed the lid with care, his fingers lingering a second longer. A breeze rustled the leaves. Somewhere, a chime rang faintly in the wind. And far beyond that quiet night, across oceans and languages and borders, people sat down with pens in hand, ready at last to write what their hearts had held far too long. It was a quiet night in the garden. Elon sat alone on one of the weathered benches near the edge of the lake, a soft breeze brushing the sleeves of his navy blue jacket. Autumn had left golden leaves scattered across the paths like fragments of old conversations. In his hands were letters, some typed, others handwritten in ink that had started to fade. Each carried a different voice, a longing, a confession of farewell. He had been there for hours, reading in silence, letting the quiet of the garden settle inside him like an old friend. Then his phone buzzed. He almost didn't answer. Distractions were rare here, and he guarded the space from the noise of the outside world. But something made him look. The screen displayed a name that had once been familiar, then distant, then almost painful. Kimball, his younger brother. Elon stared for a moment before swiping to answer. He brought the phone to his ear, unsure of what voice he would hear after all this time. Kimball. There was a pause, a breath, then a voice choked by emotion. Hey, it's me. Elon sat up, suddenly aware of his own heartbeat. I read about the garden, Kimball said, his voice trembling. You built something I never could have. I don't know how to say it, but I'm proud of you. There it was. Not accusation, not discomfort, just a raw, unexpected tenderness that caught Elon off guard. I wasn't trying to be brave, Elon replied quietly. I just didn't want to carry the silence anymore. On the other end, Kimball gave a soft laugh, the kind that carries both sorrow and relief. Dad wrote to me too. Years ago. I kept the letter in a drawer. I couldn't bring myself to read it. I thought maybe ignoring it would protect me. Elon swallowed. The moment felt delicate, as if saying the wrong thing might scatter it like dry leaves in the wind. Open it, he said, voice low but steady. I'm here. You don't have to do it alone. The silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of memories, of childhood birthdays with cake that always tasted like tension, of backyard games interrupted by lectures, of a father who loved with awkward hands and rigid words. For the first time in years, they began to speak freely, not as figures in separate worlds, not as symbols in media shadows, but as brothers, real, flawed, and suddenly vulnerable. They remembered the Christmas when their father tried to cook dinner himself and burned the roast, but refused help. They laughed about how he never quite learned to hug properly, how his arms hovered like he was waiting for instructions. He didn't know how to love out loud, Kimball said, but he tried, in his weird way. Elon nodded, even though Kimball couldn't see. He did, and sometimes that's more than we realize. 2 days later, Kimball arrived in California. They met not at a Tesla site or a press event, but at the gates of the Memorial Garden, Elon waiting by the path, Kimball with a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder and eyes that mirrored exhaustion and resolve. No words were needed. They walked slowly beneath the canopy of trees, letting the rhythm of the leaves guide their steps. Here and there, they passed others, a young woman leaving a drawing for her mother, a veteran whispering to the wind, an elderly couple holding hands over a bench engraved with a daughter's name. Eventually, they reached the quietest part of the garden, where two ancient trees stood side by side like silent guardians. Beneath one, the soil had been gently upturned months ago. There lay their father's journal, buried with the small rocket sculpture Elon had commissioned. Kimball knelt and opened the envelope he had carried all this time. The letter trembled slightly in his hands as he unfolded it. Then, with a breath that sounded like forgiveness rising to the surface, he began to read aloud. Dear Kimball, it started, and the words came slowly, gently, with pauses between them. Their father had written of regrets, of missed dinners and misunderstood silences, of watching his sons grow strong and distant and not knowing how to bridge the distance, of loving them too much and too poorly, and of hope that one day they would read his words not with bitterness, but with compassion. When the letter ended, Kimball's hands dropped to his knees. Tears streamed down his face, unchecked. He didn't try to hide them. Elon stepped forward and wrapped his arms around him. It wasn't a dramatic gesture, no music, no speech, just two men embracing under the shadows of 1,000 things unsaid. The kind of hug that rewrites years of misunderstanding in a single, long breath. They sat there for what felt like an eternity. Two brothers rediscovering the language of family. Later that afternoon, they wrote a new letter together, pen shared between them, phrases discussed with care. Dear Dad, it read, we're here, together, not to spite you, but because of you. We carried your silence for a long time, but now we carry something else. understanding, gratitude, even love. They placed the letter inside the iron box at the heart of the garden. As they stood together, the sun began its slow descent. Its light fell gently through the leaves, painting the benches in gold and amber. The garden glowed, not in a grand or miraculous way, but in the simple, sacred way that moments do when they are true. Do you think he'd be proud? Kimball asked quietly. Elon didn't answer right away. He looked at the trees, the box, the flowers planted by grieving hands and hopeful hearts. I think, he said finally, he'd be at peace. And that night, the garden gained not just another letter, but another chapter, one of reunion, of healing, and of the quiet miracle that happens when broken things begin to mend. The wind was gentle that morning, brushing lightly through the rows of blooming white and blue flowers in the garden. The sunlight filtered in golden streaks through the trees, casting warm patches over the worn stone paths and wooden benches. Elon Musk had arrived early that day, long before any visitors. He often did that now, walking the garden in silence, as if listening for stories not yet told. The quiet grounded him, and in that stillness, he felt close to something he couldn't name. It was during one of these early visits that he saw them. At the edge of the path, near the entrance where gravel crunched under slow-moving wheels, an elderly woman appeared, pushing a wheelchair with steady, deliberate care. She was small, perhaps no taller than 5 feet, with hair like thin silver thread, gathered in a loose bun. Her hands trembled slightly as they gripped the chair's handles, but her eyes, those eyes held a fierce tenderness. Sitting in the wheelchair was a girl no older than 9, with soft brown curls and large, searching eyes that didn't quite match her age. Her legs rested limp, tucked under a pale pink blanket, and on her lap sat a small electric keyboard, worn at the edges. Elon stepped aside, watching them pass with quiet reverence. The woman looked up, noticing him, and nodded politely. She didn't recognize him, which Elon found comforting. They made their way to the heart of the garden, near the stone box that held hundreds of folded letters, some hopeful, some broken, all sacred. The elderly woman guided the wheelchair close to the bench and helped the little girl arrange her keyboard. The girl plugged in the small instrument to a portable battery and rested her fingers gently on the keys. There was something ceremonial in her movements, as if she were about to speak the only language she truly trusted. Elon approached slowly, standing behind them, but within earshot. The woman looked back at him and offered a soft smile. "She wants to play for her grandfather," she said, her voice catching. She never met him. He passed before she was born, but she dreams of him every night. Elon felt a wave of stillness settle over the air. The birds that had chirped earlier seemed to hush. Even the wind paused, listening. The girl closed her eyes and began to play. The melody was simple, untrained, but it had weight. It was delicate, yet not fragile. The kind of music that sounded like memory. Her fingers danced slowly across the keys, pressing with care, not force. She played from a place deeper than technique, something raw and untouched. The notes flowed like they belonged there, among the garden and its ghosts. Elon blinked away the heat rising in his eyes. The woman leaned toward him, whispering. She says it's the song he sings to her in her sleep. She hears it when she closes her eyes, and she's been trying to play it ever since. The performance lasted no more than 3 minutes, but time warped within it. When the final note faded into the late morning breeze, the girl opened her eyes and smiled. "He heard it," she said confidently. "I know he did." Elon crouched beside her, unsure of what to say. He looked into her face, not the face of a child who played for applause, but one who believed in things others had forgotten. He pulled from his pocket a small object he had carried with him for years without knowing why. It was a silver medal, once gifted to him at a conference he barely remembered. On its surface was a simple engraving, "Where there is love, there is presence." He placed it gently into the girl's hand. "That was beautiful," he said, voice low. "This is for you, for bringing your grandfather here." The girl looked at the medal, and then at Elon. "I think he'll like it," she said matter-of-factly, and then tucked it into the pouch on her wheelchair. The grandmother walked toward the letterbox and slipped in a folded sheet of paper. Her hands trembled more now. "Thank you," she said, turning to Elon without needing to know his name, "for building a place where even the ones who never arrived can still be remembered." Elon stood in silence long after they had gone. He sat on the bench they had occupied, the faint scent of lavender still lingering in the air. He looked out over the garden, and it looked back, alive with invisible threads of memory and longing. In that moment, he knew something essential had shifted. This wasn't a place just for letters anymore. It was a place for communion, where time bent and hearts reached beyond the veil of logic and grief. It was a haven for those who believe that love outlives absence, and that sometimes a melody is more truthful than words. That evening, as the sun dipped below the tree line, Elon made a decision. He called a local sound engineer and commissioned the installation of hidden speakers throughout the garden. They would be subtle, respectful, tucked among the branches, concealed beneath stonework. And every day, at dusk, soft melodies would drift through the space. Nothing grand, nothing to draw attention, just music. Gentle like a whisper, familiar like a dream. He asked the engineer to include the melody the girl had played. They recorded it together from her home the following week, with Elon quietly watching as the little girl, now beaming, played the tune again, this time into proper microphones. She laughed when she missed a note and insisted on trying again. When the installation was complete, the first sunset melody played as a hush fell over the garden. Visitors paused, lifting their heads. A mother held her child tighter. A man closed his eyes and breathed deeper. And somewhere, maybe in the spaces we don't quite understand, a grandfather smiled. From that day on, every letter placed into the stone box carried not just ink and paper, but harmony. Notes wrapped around words, like light around shadow, as if each message had wings. Elon stood under the same tree where the girl had once played, listening. It wasn't science. It wasn't technology. It was soul. And it had started with a child, a dream, and a piano barely big enough for two hands. It was a quiet Wednesday morning when Elon found the envelope. It came by mail, nestled between logistics documents and formal invitations. The handwriting was shaky but careful, as if each letter had been etched with the weight of memory. The return address was from a hospice facility in Nebraska. There was no sender's name on the front, just the words, "For the garden where my silence can finally speak." Inside was a letter, 3 pages, written in blue ink that had bled faintly along the folds. Elon sat alone in the small wooden shed where he kept the daily correspondence sent to the memorial. He began to read slowly. "Mr. Musk," it started, "I am 74. I do not have the strength to travel, nor the time left to wait for strength. But when I heard about your garden, something inside me trembled loose. It was the kind of trembling that comes before tears, the kind that means something long buried wants to surface." The writer introduced himself simply as James. He wrote of a life lived half in shadow, of being a young father who had run from diapers and lullabies, run from arguments and hospital visits, run from the quiet terror of not knowing how to love. "I thought I wasn't enough," he wrote, "and so I left before I could prove it." His son, he said, had been 3 when he vanished from their lives. A boy with big eyes and a slow, curious smile. James followed his son's life from a distance, anonymously. Newspaper clippings, social media photos, even a blog once written by the boy's high school teacher. But he never wrote, never called, never appeared. I carried my shame like a stone in my chest. I told myself he was better off without me, that his life would be cleaner, lighter. But now, with bones brittle and breath hard to hold, I wish I had stayed to see him grow. I wish I had said something. The letter trembled in Elon's hands. The final lines read, "If by some twist of fate my son ever visits your garden, please tell him this. I loved him, clumsily, fearfully, but truly. I loved him the only way I knew how, by disappearing before I could disappoint him." Elon stared out the window, the wind moving through the trees with an almost reverent hush. He folded the letter carefully, placed it in a glass envelope, and walked outside. He stopped between two birch trees where the light filtered softly through the leaves. There, he had one of the gardeners plant a single sunflower, tall, golden, unapologetically bright. Beneath it, a small wooden sign simply read, James. Later that afternoon, as the light began to lean westward and the air smelled faintly of pine and dried leaves, Elon returned to the garden. He stood near the sunflower, the letter in hand, and began to read it aloud. His voice was calm, but something in it trembled, the kind of tremble that carries not weakness, but depth. Visitors nearby paused their walks. A woman stopped mid-sentence while placing a letter in the box. A child ceased running and held his mother's hand more tightly. The garden quieted as if the trees themselves were listening. Unbeknownst to Elon, a young man sat not 20 feet away, on a stone bench beneath the shade of a chestnut tree. He had been reading a blog that morning, a quiet, anonymous corner of the internet where someone had shared James's letter. He hadn't planned to come. He didn't even know if it was true. But something, intuition, hope, longing, had brought him. When he heard his father's words, his breath caught. He stood, unsure of his own legs, and stepped forward as Elon lowered the letter. Was that James? He asked, his voice cracking. Elon turned, eyes wide. Are you? My name's Lucas. He paused, then added, James was my father's name. Elon didn't speak. He simply offered the letter. Lucas took it with trembling hands. He read it in silence, lips moving slightly as he followed every curve of his father's penmanship. His face twisted, grief, disbelief, release. This is the first time, he whispered, that I've ever heard my father say he loved me. He folded the letter slowly, like it might shatter. Then, without a word, he hugged Elon. Not a ceremonial handshake or a polite gesture. A real vulnerable embrace, one that held years of silence, confusion, abandonment, and now, a fragile redemption. I think he was waiting for me to hear it, Lucas said. Somewhere. Somehow. They stood there, side by side, watching the sunflower sway in the gentle breeze. Lucas wrote a new letter. His hands were steady now. Dad, I'm still angry, but I'm also free. I think that's what love can do. Untangle knots we stop trying to untie. You spoke too late, but I'm listening anyway. You reached me. Thank you. I'll be okay now. He left it at the base of the sunflower and turned to go. Elon watched him walk away, his steps lighter, as though he were no longer dragging a story that didn't belong solely to him. That night, Elon returned to the sunflower and sat alone. The moon cast pale ribbons of silver over the petals. The garden was silent, but he felt something alive in the air, something like breath or prayer. He stared at the flower, wondering how many other Jameses were out there. How many Lucases? How many hearts aching not for a miracle, but simply for a sentence? He touched the wooden sign. It was warm from the day's light. Maybe heaven, he thought, is made of things like this. Words finally spoken. Love finally heard. And the sunflower nodded gently in the wind, like a soul at peace. Elon was already sitting when he saw her approach, tall, proud, elegant in that timeless way only she carried. But her steps were slower than usual. Not weak, no, just thoughtful. Each one seemed to carry decades. She wore a soft cream shawl draped over a tailored navy dress, and in her eyes shimmered something between memory and water. The wind moved gently through the garden, combing the leaves with invisible fingers as Musk entered the space that until Enteo belonged to strangers' grief and her son's quiet reckoning. Today, it would hold something more personal. Elon rose when she came close. No words were needed at first. They simply stood there, mother and son, looking at one another with a gaze only people who've known pain and survived can share. Then May smiled faintly. You chose a beautiful place, she said, glancing around at the tall trees and the low hum of life all around. I wasn't sure I'd be ready, but I had to come. I was waiting for you, Elon replied, his voice calm but weighted. He gestured toward the bench, the same bench where he had once dreamed of his father. They sat side by side, the silence between them rich with unspoken things. He and I, she began, her voice catching. We were so young, so foolish, so proud, but we loved Elon. We really did. Even if the love sometimes looked like absence or anger, it was there. She reached into her bag and carefully unfolded a fragile piece of paper, edges yellowed with time. This, she said, handing it to him, is what he gave me the day you were born. I never showed you. I don't know why. Elon took the letter with slow, reverent fingers. The ink had faded, but the handwriting was unmistakable, his father's, strong and slanted. He read silently, "Our son will be great, even if he never forgives me. I already know I've done too much wrong, but I hope he dreams beyond me." Elon didn't speak. He couldn't. His throat tightened, his hands trembled, and the paper blurred behind a sheen of tears he didn't wipe away. He knew, May whispered. He always knew you were destined for something, and he was terrified he'd be the reason you'd never believe in yourself. I thought he didn't care, Elon murmured, voice cracking under years of misunderstanding. He was so hard, so distant. He was afraid, she said simply. Afraid you'd see right through him. They fell into each other then, not as inventors or icons, but as people wounded by the same man, healed by the same memories. Elon leaned into her shoulder, and May rested her cheek against his head. They cried together, the tears not just of pain, but of release. As if grief had finished its journey, and now sat quietly, content to simply be understood. Around them, the garden felt different, greener, fuller. Birds landed softly in nearby trees. An array of sunlight broke through the canopy, spotlighting the earth like a benediction. Even the wind paused, as if to give this moment its due reverence. For a while, they said nothing. They didn't need to. Time itself seemed to stretch and breathe around them, making space for healing. Then May looked at him, brushing a tear from his cheek. Elon, I've seen you build things people said were impossible. But this, she gestured around them, this garden, these letters, this is your greatest invention. Elon blinked slowly, caught off guard. It doesn't rise into the sky like your rockets, she continued, but it dives into something deeper. Something we all try to avoid, the heart. A silence settled, deeper than before. Not heavy, sacred. At the exit of the garden, before stepping away, May took one more letter from her purse. She walked alone to the central box, the one now surrounded by blue flowers, soft lights, and decades of emotion, and slid her note inside. Elon watched from a distance. He didn't need to ask what she wrote. Later, long after she'd left, when the sun was dipping into the golden hush of late afternoon, Elon approached the box. He didn't open her letter. He wouldn't. But the words were meant to echo nonetheless. Written in delicate cursive on the envelope. To the father of my son, thank you for giving him dreams. Elon stood there, holding the note to his chest as he closed his eyes. And in that stillness, in the hush of branches and the whisper of earth, something clicked into place. His life, so often propelled by the next launch, the next challenge, had paused. Just long enough to let the past breathe. He realized then that what he had built wasn't just a memorial. It was a bridge. Between generations, between wounds and forgiveness, between the seen and the unseen. And as he looked around at the benches that had held sorrow, the trees that had heard confessions, the soil that now carried the letters of strangers and family alike, he felt something sacred. May had said it best, this garden didn't go up to the stars. It came down to the heart, and that was the only direction that ever truly mattered. The garden no longer belonged only to Elon. What had once been a quiet corner of reflection behind his estate had slowly transformed into something beyond even his understanding. It was no longer just a tribute to a father, nor merely a space for grief. It had become a living memorial, a breathing, blooming testament to the invisible threads that hold hearts together even after time has tried to sever them. Each morning brought new footsteps along its gravel paths. What began with solitary wanderers seeking solace had turned into a slow-moving procession of connection. One weekday, a school bus arrived. Children, holding hands in pairs, followed their teacher between the rows of benches and flowers. They didn't run or shout. Somehow, they felt the weight of the place. They knelt beside the old wooden mailbox, gently fingering the corners of handwritten letters, some faded, some fresh. A boy with glasses stopped beside the pond and whispered, "Can I leave something?" The teacher nodded. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded piece of notebook paper, clumsy with glue and glitter, and placed it inside the mailbox. The envelope read, "To my mom in heaven. I got an A in math." Elon had watched from a distance, not as a guardian nor a curator, but as someone who knew the quiet ache behind such words. Soon, the garden began to appear in lesson plans. Teachers taught about memory, forgiveness, and the language of grief, not in theory, but through the raw humanity contained in those letters. One educator stood under the olive tree and told her students, "Words don't need to be perfect to heal. They just need to be true." Couples began visiting too, young, old, estranged, or simply weary. At twilight, benches filled with pairs holding hands, holding regrets, or holding nothing at all but shared silence. Some wrote together, some wrote apart, and often they left behind small notes with trembling handwriting and smudged ink. "I still believe in us. I never said it enough, but you mattered. Forgive me for the years I spent behind my pride." Then there were the widows. Graceful and soft-spoken, they arrived alone, but never lonely. They came with letters yellowed by time, some tied in ribbon, others dog-eared from decades of reading. Sitting under the branches, they read aloud, quietly, reverently, as if the trees themselves were listening. One woman with silver curls whispered, "He never made it to our 50th anniversary, but I brought him anyway." She kissed the top of her letter before placing it into the box. Children, too young to remember their grandparents, began to visit with their families. They scribbled letters with crayons and markers, always simple, always piercing. "Grandpa, I love you even if I never met you. You live in my mom's smile. I drew us holding hands in heaven." It wasn't that the world had grown softer. Tragedy still unfolded. Pain still echoed through headlines. People still hurt each other and themselves. But something had shifted subtly, like the turning of a season. There was now a place, a real, physical place, where that pain could be spoken, acknowledged, and released. And in this world, Elon's name began to take on a new shape. He was no longer only the man of rockets, algorithms, and unrelenting ambition. People started to associate him with something warmer, something timeless. They spoke of him not with awe, but with gratitude. They said, "He built a place where healing happens." But Elon didn't take ownership of the garden. He refused interviews about it. Whenever reporters asked him what it meant, he would only say, "This place doesn't belong to me. It belongs to anyone who loves in silence." There was no plaque bearing his name, no monument. The only clue to his connection was a small inscription on the side of the mailbox, hand-carved in wood. Even unspoken love can be heard here. One afternoon, a priest visited. He walked slowly, hands behind his back, and spent over an hour just reading letters. As he stood to leave, he passed Elon sitting alone near the lake. "You've done something sacred here," he said. "In this place, God walks between the words." Elon turned to him, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe he is one of the letters, one we've been too busy to read." The priest said nothing, only touched Elon's shoulder and walked away. Sometimes people asked Elon if he regretted not reconciling with his father in life. They wanted to know if this garden was a replacement for closure, if it had come too late. He never gave the answer they expected. "I think," he'd begin, pausing as if measuring each syllable, "some stories don't resolve in time, but they can resolve in soul." Then always that subtle smile, not with his mouth, but with his eyes. The kind of smile that knew pain but had made peace with it. Elon had learned to sit quietly under the tree where he once dreamed of his father. He no longer needed visions to feel his presence. The garden itself had become the dream, alive, blooming, filled with messages that reached past death and beyond explanation. Each letter was a bridge, each bench a reunion, Each flower a memory blooming twice, once in the past and once again in forgiveness. He walked among the guests like any other visitor. Sometimes he watered the plants. Other times, he picked up wind-blown envelopes and returned them gently to the box. He didn't correct those who didn't recognize him. He didn't expect thanks. One afternoon, a child tugged at his sleeve. "Do you work here?" she asked. Elon looked around the garden, at the sun catching the edge of a letter, an old woman smiling at the sky, at a couple holding hands for the first time in years. He nodded. "Yes, I think I do." And when the girl ran off to join her parents, he sat back on the bench and looked out at the world he had never imagined building, but that somehow had become his most meaningful creation. Because in the end, this was more than a garden. It was proof that even the quietest love, delayed, wounded, misunderstood, could take root and bloom. The years passed like the turning pages of a cherished book, worn soft by the fingers of time. The garden, once a quiet corner built from grief and memory, had grown into something else entirely, something sacred. Trees once young now formed a canopy of shade that danced with golden light in the afternoons. The letters still came, folded, faded, written in trembling hands or in the clumsy script of children who had never met the ones they wrote to. And then, one morning, when the breeze carried the scent of lavender and something almost like hope, a new bench appeared beneath the central tree. It had no name, no ornate carvings, no bronze plate listing dates of birth or final breaths. Just a small wooden sign, carved by hand, worn by weather and love. For all fathers. It was the only bench in the garden that faced upward toward the sky, rather than inward toward the walking path or the mailbox of letters. It didn't invite conversation or contemplation of the flowers. It invited surrender, breath, tears, forgiveness. It quickly became the most visited bench in the entire memorial, and also, curiously, the most silent. People would arrive and sit in solitude, some clutching letters, others just clutching their hands together, as if in prayer. Some cried openly, some exhaled deeply, some just tilted their faces toward the sky, letting sunlight fall on their cheeks like the touch of a long-lost hand. One afternoon, a man came in a wheelchair, wheeled by a quiet nurse who seemed to understand the solemnity of his journey. His name was Leonard. He was 90 years old. His eyes were milky but alert, his hands curled with age, holding a single letter in an envelope that had yellowed with time. He asked the nurse to stop just beside the bench. He looked at it for a long time, then finally said, "I never spoke to my father again after I turned 18. Thought I didn't need to." He held up the letter, pressed it to his lips, and whispered, "But now I talk to him every day. Here." The nurse placed the letter gently in the old wooden mailbox nearby. Leonard stared at the sky for a few minutes more, then nodded, as if he'd received an answer. Elon Musk didn't visit the garden as often anymore. Life, projects, the gravity of the world pulled him in countless directions. But every time he returned, he walked the same slow path. Past the benches with names, the fountain built from stones donated by visitors, the tree that now held wind chimes that sang in soft tones. And always, always, he paused at the last bench. That day he was alone, dressed simply in a navy jacket and dark jeans, sunglasses hanging loosely from his collar. He stood in front of the bench for several minutes before sitting down, his hands resting on his knees. The breeze tousled his hair like an invisible parent would, gently and without rush. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. No envelope, just a note folded 3 times. He placed it on the bench beside him, smoothed it out with 2 fingers, and whispered its contents softly. "Father, today I see you in every hidden act of love." He didn't cry, not this time. There were no more tears left for that part of the story. Only understanding, only peace. He stood up, left the note on the bench, and walked away without looking back. Visitors who came later that day found the note. Some read it. Most simply left it where it was, as if the bench had written it itself. The letter would remain there for weeks, untouched by rain, as if even nature understood its importance. Eventually, it was moved to a glass box near the mailbox, next to a sign that read, "Letters that changed the garden." People began to call it the last bench, but it was also the beginning of a new kind of remembering. A space not only for children to speak to the parents they lost, but for parents to remember the children they had once been, to forgive themselves, to dream differently. A young woman came one evening, just before closing. She sat on the last bench with a child on her lap and said, "Your grandfather would have loved your laugh." The toddler giggled and clapped, unaware that her small hands were making history softer. A middle-aged man left a bouquet and whispered, "I wish I'd understood you sooner, Dad." Then sat still for an hour, eyes closed, finally allowing himself to feel the weight he'd been carrying. Another woman, a recent widow, sat down with no letter, no words. She simply breathed. When she stood, her expression had changed, like someone who'd unburdened herself without speaking a word. Each story written into that bench made it sacred, not because it was made of wood or placed beneath the oldest tree, but because it had become a mirror for the love that rarely gets spoken in time, a mirror for the words we wish we'd said when saying them still felt possible. The garden lived on. It became part of local school field trips, part of wedding proposals, part of final farewells. Some people came every year on the same date, others just once in a lifetime. Elon never claimed ownership. He always said, "This place belongs to anyone who loves in silence." When a priest visited and remarked, "It feels like God walks here between the letters," Elon had replied, "Maybe he is one of the letters, waiting to be read." And when asked in an interview if he regretted not reconciling with his father during his lifetime, he smiled gently and answered, "Not every story ends in time, but it can still find peace in the soul." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That was the power of the garden. It didn't require explanations, only presence. It continued to bloom. It continued to receive letters. And it continued to whisper softly that every silence held the possibility of a word still waiting to be born. And it all began with a letter, and the heart of a son who finally chose to listen. Now, dear viewer, I'd love to hear from you. Did this story stir a memory in your heart? Leave a comment with a memory it awakened in you. I read every single one with care.